Well, good evening and welcome to the latest edition of the Definite Article, where each week we discuss a recent article written by an IEA author. I'm Syed Kamall, I'm the IEA's Academic and Research Director, and tonight I'm delighted to be joined by my IEA colleagues, Julian Jessop, who's an Economics Fellow, and Professor Len Shackleton, the Editorial and Research Fellow. Tonight we'll be discussing Julian's article in the Daily Telegraph, which is titled, "Every 3 months that schools are shut could cost almost 22 billion." He's also written for the IEA blog a similar article titled "School Closures Carry a Heavy Economic Price." And also our Director of Communications, Annabelle Denham, has written an article for CAPEX titled "Our Kids Don't Need a Summer Holiday, They Need the Classroom." So this shows that the school debate rages on, punctuated somewhat by the government's U-turn last week on all primary school pupils return to the classroom before the summer holidays. We've seen secondary schools reopened, some students this week. In fact, one of my sons went back to school this week for about 4 hours, following in the footsteps of those primary schools which have already allowed reception year 1 and year 6 pupils to return. But the government has been accused of dithering. But even with half of our primary schools open, only 7% of children were in school as of the 4th of June. Now, the case has been made by more than one member of the IEA team that normality cannot return until the schools do. 8 million families across the UK have school-aged children. The attainment gap is widening. It may take years to close. For example, 700,000 children are not doing their homework. So why don't we start with the author of tonight's featured article, Julian Jessop. Let me come to you first. You wrote in the Telegraph and on the IEA blog that every 3 months schools are shut could cost 22 billion. Now, many articles are written about the slow pace of reopening, and they focus on children's well-being. But before we come to the well-being angle, could you talk us through the economic costs as outlined in your articles?
Well, thank you. First of all, as it happens, I think the well-being angle would be enough to argue in favour of getting schools as open as early as possible. Obviously, all the damage being done to children's emotional development and mental health and so on. So I think that in itself is enough to be worried about. But there's also some good reason to think there's a substantial and wider economic cost as well. If we think first in terms of the longer-term impact, I mean, obviously people go to school and university for a reason, and that's to make them more productive, to allow them to contribute more to the economy and to earn more. So if they're missing out on education, that has some sort of long-term cost. There is a bit of a controversy about how big this cost is. It is true that there's a clear link between years of education and how much you earn, but that may partly be because of what's sometimes called a signalling effect, or in other words, education might be a positional good. So the fact that you've been to university and somebody hasn't might allow you to send a signal to an employer that you're a good person to give a job to. It doesn't necessarily mean your productivity is any higher. It's just that that's something that employers might find useful. However, there is still plenty of evidence that there is an additional effect, which is that your human capital, as economists call it, is genuinely improved by having a better education. There are various studies, for example, that suggest that each year in education might add anywhere between 5 and perhaps as much as 10% to your earning power. So if children are missing perhaps a quarter of a year, then that could be a whole generation that is missing out on sort of 2 to 3% of earning power over their entire lives. That's the long-term effect. In the short run, though, and this is where my sort of 22 billion ballpark number comes in, I think you can look at that in two parts. One is the lost output in the education sector itself. That, of course, is a cost to the economy, but you can also see that as a proxy for the benefits that education brings. If you look at the contribution that the education sector makes to GDP, it's about 5 or 6% of GDP that is being lost if the entire education sector is shut down. If we assume just a small part of that, then that quite easily could be 1 or 2% of GDP. That could add up to at least 10 billion over 3 months. And then the other thing that you're losing, of course, is not just the damage to the education of the children, but to the damage of the productivity of those parents who are stuck at home having to look after them. So there's plenty of evidence that children, when they're being looked after by their parents are less able to work as much as they'd otherwise have done. Some parents may not be able to work at all. So there's the additional effect that might double that that 10 billion or so in terms of lost work done by parents. So you quite quickly get to a plausible figure of around 20 billion for every 3 months of education that's lost. Now, as I say, that is very much a ballpark number, but it's pretty significant. If we could think of other interventions in the economy that would add 20 billion plus over a 3-month period, I think we'd be jumping at them. So the fact that the children are staying at home, missing out on education, and many parents are unable to work because of that, I think is definitely having a significant economic impact.
Okay, well, Len, you've heard what Julian said. Is there anything that you'd like to add, or any other points of view you'd like to give?
Well, I don't think I entirely agree with the idea that this is a permanent loss. I think children are remarkably resilient, and I think we need to focus on what we can do to get the schools back, rather than worrying too much about what the theoretical cost of this is going to be. And it does concern me that, I was reading the other day that in the 3 days in September 1939, we somehow managed to get 1.5 million children out of the cities and into the countryside as part of the evacuation program. And yet today, we seem to be having major difficulties in organising schooling for young people. Even though we've had weeks and weeks and weeks at it. And the idea that we're still talking about maybe September, but probably it's going to run over into October or November before we get back to some kind of normal schooling, I think is really a significant failure of our schooling system. And we do have to ask questions about the way in which the state runs these things, I think, in future. As Julian knows, the private sector has shown a fair degree of resilience in this, in getting a proper online teaching program. The independent schools can't go back at the moment because of all sorts of hassles about insurance and so forth, which the government could sort out if it put its mind to it. But it's actually, despite this, it's provided much better service to school students than the bulk of the state sector. I mean, there are some very good cases in the state sector where things have worked okay, but on the whole, the performance has not been great. And certainly as a parent, I find this. I've got my 4-year-old back at school now under sort of bizarre arrangements, but my 10-year-old is kicking his heels upstairs, most of the day, trying to think of things we can give him to do and so on. This is not really, what we expect in the 21st century from our schooling system.
Len, I wonder if I could push you on that. The debate is not really about. It's more than a binary choice between open and shut. There are considerations around, for example, which year groups return, whether social distancing in school is necessary or desirable, the level of social distancing, and some have strenuously argued that we should scrap social distancing and the bubble strategy in the classroom. Do you have any views on that, Julian?
Well, in terms of the people as pupils, it's most important to get back. I think the evidence is that the early start that you get is the most important. So primary school children, it's the most important, I think, to get those back to school. As it happens also in terms of the health risks, obviously the younger children seem to be far less at risk from coronavirus as well. So you've got 2 reasons there, both the educational benefits and also the smaller health risks for getting primary school children back. The other group is those people who are closer to doing absolutely critical exams. And here there is plenty of evidence that hours of proper teaching are very strongly correlated with exam performance or test results. So, Len is right that in the longer term you can get a lot of this back. It can be catch up, but that's hard to do if you're approaching an exam very, very in a short period after the school hours are being missed. So I would prioritise primary school children, those closer to exams, which as it happens is what the government is doing. So clearly they're getting the same sort of advice from other people as I would be giving them. In terms of the social distancing, the evidence here, for what it's worth, is that keeping people 2 meters apart does reduce the risk compared to being 1 metre apart. On the other hand, if that risk is very small to begin with, then clearly 2 metres versus 1 metre is less of a key factor. And again, that's where the fact that children seem to be less vulnerable to coronavirus is important. If you're making only a change to a very, very small risk in the first place, then I think there is clearly a stronger case for relaxing social distancing rules in the context of education than there might be in some other contexts. So again, obviously the health evidence has to lead there, but I think there's a case for being a bit more flexible in schools than there would be for environments where older and more vulnerable people are more heavily involved.
Would you agree with that, Len?
I would, but I think the social distancing is a slight red herring, whatever you think of that. The fact is that a lot of children are not getting any real contact with the school at all. And they ought to think out of the box and think in terms of bringing kids for maybe a day or 2 days a week, coming in at weekends and so forth, to give all children some real experience of school on which you can build homework and work which they do in their own time and so forth. But at the moment, many of our children have just absolutely no contact with their school. And I think that's a terrible state to be in.
I would say to viewers, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, please do type in on YouTube. But we've already had one comment from Ian Hines, and he makes the point, if you recall your own experience, you were probably more controllable in the first year of each school level. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's an awful long time ago. I'm not sure I really remember.
That old chestnut, Julian. Yeah.
But yes, I mean, a good start is absolutely essential, and that is reflected in a lot of the evidence of the benefit of schooling on earning power. That early years seem to be more important than later years, and actually there's some evidence that a university education, the returns to that are diminishing significantly. That might be partly because many more people are going to university, so it's less useful as a sort of signal to employers than it used to be. But I think everybody, whether an economist or an educational specialist, would agree that it's the early years that are absolutely critical to get young kids used to a structured routine, and also important for their emotional development to mingle with other children. So it's not just the formal education, it's the social activities, the sporting activities around that. So I think there's overwhelming evidence that it's primary school children that we should be most concerned about here. And as I was saying earlier, that's consistent also with what the health advice would be, that primary school children are least vulnerable to coronavirus than pretty much any other group. So let's focus on getting those back, and then after that, those children who are closest to absolutely life-critical exams, they need to get back as well.
Len, would you agree?
I'm not sure I entirely would. I don't quite understand why my 4-year-old is back, my 10-year-old isn't. At 4, you're not even legally obliged to go to school. We start kids in formal schooling much earlier than most other countries in Europe, for example. And I would have thought it's important to get all kids having experiences. I'm not particularly sure that the very first year of schooling is something which should be prioritised. But the point is that we've got a system which doesn't really seem to know where it's going at the moment, and we haven't got any very clear guidance from governments. And it does suggest to me that we ought to think in terms in the future of moving away from this kind of monolithic state schooling system which we've got. And it's interesting that academy schools, for instance, have been rather more proactive than the standard state schools. And we ought to think about greater independence for schools, greater initiative from schools, perhaps, and more consultation with parents as well.
Okay, before I move on to other questions, we've got one question in. Please, for the viewers on YouTube, please keep the questions coming. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button for our YouTube channel, IEA London. You'll be viewing us on that at the moment. So next question is, in CapX, Annabelle calls for lateral thinking. Shouldn't the summer holidays be scrapped and get students back into school as soon as possible? What do you think, Len?
I think that's rather what I was talking about earlier on. Don't stick with the standard way of doing this. And yes, I appreciate that many teachers will have been working quite hard during this period, but I'm not so sure it's it's true across the board. And the idea that well, our whole school year anyway is crazy, I think. This gap in the summer when we know from evidence that kids forget a lot of stuff over the summer. We'd be much better, really, in many ways, in having much, the same number of teaching days, if you like, but spread more evenly over the year instead of having this big gap in the summer, which creates all sorts of problems, overcrowding on holiday destinations and things like that. So I think Annabelle is right that we should think out of the box. We should think of different ways of doing it. But the trouble is, when you've got a basically monolithic state system without proper leadership at the moment, then you're just floundering around, and you don't get the chance to try different experiments and different ways of doing things.
So, Julian, how would you and your child think about, what would you think about if the summer holidays were scrapped and your child was told to go to school? How do you feel?
Well, I think I'd be in favour of that, and so as it happens, would she. I mean, to an extent, we've had quite a long stay-at-home holiday already, and a bit more flexibility over the summer in particular, I think would be welcome, even if it's only sort of a few weeks out of the long summer holiday when children are back into school and again seeing their friends, getting used to that sort of disciplined routine and so on. I think that'd be a great idea, and it's one of a number of things I think that the government needs to be a bit more imaginative about. Maybe there are other things that should be done as well. So providing more sort of additional tutoring, better coordination between the public and private sector. As it happens, lots of private schools have been really good at making their online learning resources available to state schools. I think that's really important. I mean, while it's true that private schools have typically done better than state schools, in partly, of course, that's because they've got more resources to do so. I think one of the valid concerns that many people have here is that people from poorer households are missing out more than those who are better off. People in poorer households often don't have an ideal working environment to learn at home. They don't necessarily have the same IT resources. Their schools aren't necessarily in the same position to provide those. So yes, private schools are doing better, but often, of course, that's because they've got the resources to do so. So anything that can be done to encourage schools to share resources more, I think would be a good thing. The good news is that some of the best private schools are doing that already.
Well, Len said earlier that we seem to be almost all over the place on this. And one of the questions that is being asked is, how is it that pubs and theme parks can reopen while schools remain shut? If the government's determined that the R number remains below 1, do trade-offs have to be made? And have we made the right priorities? Len, what do you think?
Well, one of the reasons why we have to get pubs and theme parks back is otherwise these businesses are just going to completely collapse. And that's, that is a thing about state education, that it's not going to collapse. The money keeps coming from the taxpayer. And so there isn't that pressure to get things up and running again, which there is in the pubs. I mean, what they're doing in relation to pubs is extraordinary, I think. The Mayor of London is saying that they won't be allowing any vertical drinking in London. Well, that destroys the whole basis of pubs, because most pubs are fairly small inside. With social distancing, you can only get half a dozen people in some of them. So I wouldn't. It's a debating point, that, isn't it? That pubs certainly have to open, theme parks have to open. But schools have to open as well. It's not a question of either or, I think.
Yeah. Julian, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, two things. I mean, partly, of course, it's a question of timing. I mean, the pressure is to get pubs open in July and August. As it happens, many schools will be closed at that time anyway. But so this is where the summer schools point comes in. I think if schools weren't normally going to be closed in July and August, then we'd be having a different conversation. The second point, though, is it's a problem that economists call sometimes the visible victim or the invisible victim problem. It is, as Len says, very easy to see the damage being done to the hospitality sector you can see pubs closing and so on, and people are very conscious of that. The damage being done to children is less visible. It's sort of the intangibles about the quality of education they're receiving, or things like their mental health, emotional development. And I think there is a danger that we focus too much on things that we can see and count and measure, like pubs closing or the impact on GDP, and not enough on these softer things. And I think good policy making should be about taking account of the things that are harder to measure, as well as those things that you can see immediately in front of you. And I think this maybe has been part of the problem with education. It does seem to have sort of fallen behind in terms of the priorities compared to other things, which are important as well, like obviously protecting jobs and businesses and all that sort of stuff. But we mustn't let education fall behind just because the harms being done are less visible than others.
Yeah, as Bastien will talk about the seen and the unseen, or the number of IEA authors have written about the unintended consequences, as it were. Len, you spoke earlier about the contrast between private and state sector, and you see some private schools, they're prepared to disregard government guidance and open at the start of the new academic year, come what may. Some are set up their own track and trace systems, which they aim to have up and running by September. What should free marketers, or even those who don't agree with the free market, make of this development?
I think it shows that private initiatives work better than kind of top-down policies, particularly when there is something of a policy vacuum at the moment. I wonder if I could just, talking about private sector, I wonder if I could just shift this slightly onto talking about childcare. The nursery sector, which is in a complete mess at the moment. Government policy has, we have this notional 30 hours free childcare, which has screwed up the economics of providing nursery care, because the money which the government provides for each hour is less than it costs some nurseries to run. And so they have to cross-subsidize by getting people to pay for out-of-hours care and things like this. And of course, that has collapsed in the current situation. Although many nurseries are now back functioning, they're only at about 40-45% capacity, according to the figures which I've seen recently, which means they're not in a position to cross-subsidize because they're not getting enough people in to do that. And the result is that we're going to see, I think, a lot of nurseries closing. We've also seen, although it's a kind of long-running trend, the number of childminders is really collapsing, because with social distancing, if a childminder is looking after children in their own home, which is the normal kind of arrangement, then it's just not possible to childmind in the way in which it was done before. So this sector is in a real mess, and it's very largely, I think, due to government policy, and it ought to be on somebody's radar, but it doesn't seem to be anything which is being mentioned at all. The TUC, actually, to their credit, did come out with something last week, but they were concentrating simply on the money aspect of it, whereas I think it's a more fundamental issue of the reform of childcare.
Julian, what about that? What about, first of all, the contrast between the state sector and the private sector, but also the Len's point about the childcare sector?
Okay, well, on the public-private split, as I said earlier, we have to acknowledge that private schools have an advantage because they tend to have more money, and their parents and children that go there tend to have better resources. So in a sense, it's not an entirely fair comparison. That said, there's no doubt that the private sector is more flexible. I suspect there are two reasons for that. And first of all, it's probably less under the sway of the educational trade unions, who they seem to be pretty militant, very much sort of not of the free market persuasion, and also, of course, they're less under the control of local authorities that, again, may have more sort of broader political issues and an agenda as well. So the private sector has the resources to be more flexible, but also I think the sort of the incentive and the desire to be more responsive as well. On childcare, yes, and I think that's clearly an area where government intervention has actually had sort of negative effects. Private sector nurseries that are operating as independently as they possibly can seem to be doing much better than those that are more dependent on support from the central government or local authorities, whatever else it might be. So I think that's another good example of where government intervention in the search of a good headline has actually not helped the very people it's supposed to be helping, in this case, children.
Well, I've had two questions on both of those, so I'll direct each of you. First one, David Middleton says, state control is risky, so a state schooling system is a high-risk option. Can we afford to continue with it post-crisis? I'll come to you, Julian, with that in a minute. But for Len, I'll ask you, Ian Hines has written, nurseries suffer because of the ridiculous ratios imposed on them. That's inflated the cost, and it's doubtful any benefit in a regulated regime. Julian, first.
Well, I certainly am keen on a thriving private sector in education. I think anything that allows more competition in any sector, whether it's education or anything else, surely has to be a good thing. Now, obviously, some people can't afford to send their children to private schools, so that isn't going to be appropriate for everybody. But I think the model should be that the state sector looks at what private schools are doing well, rather than what some people seem to suggest, which is the way to improve things, to shut down private schools. Not just the Etons of this world, but the old-fashioned grammar schools and all that sort of thing, and to move to an entirely state-driven system. What I'd like to see is the two systems operating in parallel, and the state system learning best practice from the private sector, rather than one being shut down in favour of the other.
And also a more affordable private sector. Over the years, certainly when I was a child, it was bank managers who sent their children to private school. Nowadays, you have to be quite wealthy or get a scholarship to send your child to private school. Len, what about this point about nurseries and the ratios imposed on them? Do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I think the research which Ryan Bourne and I did a year or two back suggests that the staffing ratios in England are much more demanding than those in some other countries, and it's not obvious that there's any great benefit for this. This is only just one aspect, of course, of the way in which childcare is regulated, and one of the problems with it is that we know government never really seems to be sure exactly what preschool childcare is for. Is it part of the education system? Is it a means of getting women back into work? Particularly single parents have been mentioned in this context. Is it meant to improve the life chances of disadvantaged groups, in which case it's not particularly well targeted? What is the objective? And we've landed ourselves with a situation which, as far as I'm aware, no other country has, where we have essentially a kind of national curriculum for tiny tots. And anybody who's been through this system, you're shown a book of photographs of your child with everybody else blocked out, because of all the data protection and so forth. And it says underneath something like, can hold a pencil. And there's a photograph of them holding a pencil. Now, this is very nice, but I know my child can hold a pencil. It's quite why we're devoting this huge amount of resource at the time of nursery care workers to doing all this form filling and photographing and so forth. That is crazy. I mean, that's how this overstaffing is actually manifested in terms of these over elaborate procedures, and this raises the costs of childcare, and as I say, it detracts nursery care workers from focusing on actually working with children. Instead, they're filling in these forms and so on. So I think there are a lot of problems with the way in which childcare is currently regulated.
So we've talked about sort of nurseries and the younger age end of the education sector. Len, both you and I teach in the university sector. You wrote in the Sunday newsletter that Buckingham University, where you are a professor, has done a good job adapting to these unusual circumstances. But however, you also say that some other institutions have fallen short. In your view, how are universities adapting, and will it be sufficient? And what impact is the coronavirus having on undergraduates, and particularly recruitment for the next academic year?
Well, that's a whole load of questions, isn't it?
Sure.
I don't particularly want to blow the trumpet for Buckingham, though I think we do give students a pretty good deal. But Buckingham is unusual in that it teaches for 4 terms a year, so we just have to keep going. Most universities essentially finish at the beginning of May anyway, so they've not had to do the kind of things which we'd necessarily had to do at Buckingham to stay in touch with students. And I don't know, Syed, what your experience of teaching online is, but actually I found it very rewarding with the students seem to enjoy it, they engage, you can see who's paying attention, who isn't. You can remember people's names, which has always been a problem for me. It actually works quite well, but it's a stopgap. And really, we want to get back to seeing people in real life as quickly as is feasible. Now, you asked about what the prospects are. Well, they're not looking great, are they? We have been, our university, and I've written about this on many occasions, our universities have become over-dependent on foreign students who have been ripped off, I think. No university is innocent in this, but quite typically, the fees charged for overseas students for exactly the same teaching as that home students get are considerably more, in some cases twice as much. And universities relied on this to subsidize other things like a proliferation of bureaucracy and a lot of research time for staff. So staff have colluded in their institutions' exploitation of students, I think. And that, those chickens are coming home to roost, I think. I think we're going to find a very different higher education sector next year with a drying up of overseas students who are not, why should you nominally enroll at a British university when all your teaching is going to be online? If you want to do that, the Open University offers some excellent courses because they've been doing it for 40 years or something, 50 years, is it now? And they're at a very professional standard. They're not just you and me talking on Teams. They're doing something much more professional. If we are going to be stuck with this for any length of time, universities have got to get their act together very, very quickly. In case of my own university, September recruitment is not looking great, but we always recruit a very large proportion of our students in January because of our 4-term year and so on. And that's looking a lot better. I mean, the hope is that by January, at least, we'll be back to something like normality.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, at our university, we've tried a variety of different methods, sometimes Zoom, sometimes meetings, sometimes recording a voice or video track with PowerPoint so they can download it in a sort of Netflix type of way for the students. And also, my university is a traditional 3-termer, or actually semesters. And then they're now looking at not only a September entrance, but now a January entrance, and merging those. So universities are having to adapt. Julian, do you have any thoughts on the university sector and where it's going to go? Whether this will lead to more innovation and what it will do to quality of teaching?
Well, the university I'm most familiar with is Cambridge, which is where I went. And I was struck that they were one of the first universities to say that the bulk of their lectures would be still online throughout the next academic year. And my initial reaction to that was quite negative. But then I thought about it. My own experience is that I didn't actually go to that many lectures. And when I did, there wasn't a lot of interaction between myself and the lecturer. I was just sitting there being, listening and taking notes. So I think online lectures is probably quite a sensible thing to do. But the real value added of education at university, I think sometimes just as it is for school, is the personal contact. So whether that's sort of small group supervisions or the social and sporting activities and so on. And I think that sort of thing has to be done face to face. And of course, if you're an overseas student, that's all the more important because you're getting the benefit of a different culture, maybe perfecting a foreign language and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot that universities can do online, I think, in terms of lectures to big groups. But when it comes to educating smaller groups, whether it's in supervisions or whatever else the system might be, or the sort of broader social experience that going to university provides, then I think that has to be done done face to face. And if universities can't offer that, then clearly they are going to lose out.
We've spoken about a number of different sectors today. We start off with the primary school, secondary school. We moved on to the nursery. We've now moved around to the university. But one of the things that is probably common in all of these is, do we understand, given our understanding of how the virus works is rudimentary, is there a harm that in letting people back, we suddenly have another flare-up? I think there have been examples in other countries where, I think it's schools, I think it's Israel, where students have been allowed back and then they've had to shut down again. How do we manage that better? Or do we just have to try it and see what happens? Julian?
Well, first of all, if you are going to expose any age group to coronavirus, then clearly younger people are less at risk than older people. I mean that is one thing that we absolutely know for sure about coronavirus is where the age-related risks are pretty clear. So that's one point. Also, of course, to some extent, keeping children at home can actually expose some older people to greater risk. I mean, it's maybe less of an issue in the UK, but in many parts of the world, it's the grandparents that do a lot of the child care. And if the children are being stuck at home while the parents are going out to work, you're actually exposing grandparents to the risk of infection from youngsters that wouldn't otherwise have happened. So I think there are, if there's one group that you are going to encourage to get out and about and do stuff, then surely it's going to be children. Inevitably, as you open up and ease the lockdown, then there is a chance that the number of infections will pick up again. But the only real alternative to that is surely just to shut everything down forever and a day. I mean, that clearly is not a sustainable position for the economy, for welfare, for any sector. So I think you have to accept that as you open up the economy, whether that's the economy in terms of pubs, restaurants, or schools, you will risk a renewed pickup in infections. But unless you're going to stick everybody in a cupboard for the rest of their lives, that is inevitable.
Well, then, so there is a concern then. You open up the schools, there's a second flare-up, the children go home, and they may be at home with elderly parents or elderly grandparents, or older grandparents or parents or grandparents. How do we manage that?
As Julian says, I think at some stage we're just going to have to bite the bullet on this. We can't bury our children away for a year, 18 months, 2 years. They're developing all the time. They need to be facing new challenges. They need to have new friends. They need to do different stuff, play games, whatever. And I think we just have to take the risk. If there is, people are now very clear about concerns about social distancing, about washing their hands, about wearing masks in environments where there is risk. I think we have to. We don't take unnecessary risks, perhaps, but we do have to say we're coming out of this. We're coming out of this, and we've got to learn to live with this until either the thing fades away, or we get a vaccine, or we get some a suite of treatments which will mean that it won't kill as many people. And then we're beginning to see signs of that, but we just can't wait for this to happen. We just have to go out and do things. And as Julian says, if we start with children, they are the least likely to be affected themselves. Yes, grandparents may be a concern, but we've been dealing with that for some time, and we shouldn't sacrifice our children's education for that.
So, Julian, as we seek to wrap up now, we are a classical liberal free market think tank. We often make the case for deregulation, liberalisation. If you look at the education sector at a number of different levels, all the way through from childcare, nursery, primary school, secondary school, through to higher education. Where can free marketeers be making the case for deregulating these sectors? Where are the calls for more government intervention and funding? Why don't I start with you, Len, to wrap up, and then Julian?
Well, these are areas where There are very strong interest groups where the solution is always more money, more staff, more of everything. I was interested earlier on. Julian was saying that in the private sector they have more resources. Yeah, but not. If you look at the amount per head, it's not actually that much greater in the private sector. You could talk about the other resources, the intangible resources, parental concern and things like this. But I think I think as an economist, and I think are we using our resources sensibly in these areas? Are we doing the right things? And the answer to me very often is that we need to give organizations, institutions more freedom. We should not have everything determined by Ofsted or by the Department of Education or whatever it may be, but we should allow experimentation. We should allow individual enterprise. And this is what liberalism is about.
And just before I come to Julian, we've just had one last minute question from David Middleton, where he says, excess deaths are now lower than in a normal year. Surely the panic problem is over.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, sorry, Len. Sorry, I'm not very good at this, am I? Yeah.
Well,
get another host for next week.
Panic, yes. It's got all the letters in pandemic, of course.
Yes.
I think we have panicked. We have overshot. The government did an excellent job of scaring us all to death. Now it has to say to us, look, guys, things are getting better. We can take some risks. We must get out of our shell, and we must start living our lives again.
So, Julian, first of all, in answer to David Middleton's question about excess deaths, and then also to sum up about where are the opportunities for deregulation, liberalisation, where are the vested interests?
Okay, well, just a note of caution on what David Middleton is saying, and others are saying. It is true, of course, that the excess deaths numbers is now come down in the last few weeks, but we have to be careful of what economists will recognise as the counterfactual. I mean, maybe the reason why the excess deaths have come down is precisely because we have had a lockdown. So, lifting the lockdown might see excess deaths surge again. So there is a caveat in there. But I think overall, I would agree that the lockdown has done its job, and the NHS has been able to survive. If anything, now the NHS probably has too much spare capacity, and lots of people are not getting the treatment that they should be receiving for illnesses that are not related to coronavirus. And I think we're getting to the point where the benefit of extending the lockdown is now far exceeded by the economic costs of keeping the economy shut down, and all the sort of less visible social costs of the lockdown in terms of mental health and missed education opportunities and so on. So I think, yes, I mean, you need to be careful of the counterfactual, but the balance of evidence is now shifting in favour of easing the lockdown rather than keeping it in place. In terms of the sort of classical free market arguments about education, I think it comes down to the basic points as ever of individual choice and competition. I think any time that the state tries to impose a one-size-fits-all policy on any sector, it's a bad thing. I think parents should be given as much choice as possible, including, by the way, how quickly they send their children back to school. If for whatever reason parents want to be cautious, then I think we need to be a bit more tolerant of them doing so. It's rather like the point about some people being cautious about returning to the shops. I think that's no bad thing. Wouldn't necessarily want everybody to rush back to the shops or everybody to rush back to school. But I think a sort of a gradual return to school over the summer months, which means having summer schools open, maybe the government investing a little bit more in infrastructure and IT, knocking up a few extra school buildings. We were able to knock up Nightingale hospitals in a couple of weeks. Why not add a few extra school buildings to help deal with social distancing as well? So a mix of maybe a bit more government investment, but above all, allowing individual schools and individual parents and families to decide to get back to normal. And I think common sense will prevail. Parents and children are probably fed up with homeschooling. I know some that definitely are. They just want to get back to life as normal as possible, as quickly as possible, and the government shouldn't stand in their way.
Well, Professor Len Shackleton, Julian Jessop, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Can I thank the viewers for watching and those also listening today? Thank you also for all your questions. We hope you'll be able to join us again soon. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, the one you're watching on, IEA London. Listen to our podcasts on Podbean, and tune into our next definite article on Monday, the 21st of June. And to help us keep providing free content during these tough times, please do consider making a contribution, no matter how modest, by donating online at iea.org.uk. Thank you for joining this evening. Please join us again soon, and in the meantime, stay safe.